Well, good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, so we'll get started. Welcome to the 6th episode of The Wild World of Bees. My name's Lincoln Best. I'm the taxonomist for the Oregon Bee Atlas, and I'll be your host this evening. The Wild World of Bees is an online lecture series you can enjoy from home to learn more about the incredible diversity and lives of wild bees. Through this series, we'll hear from great bee researchers and advocates from around North America, but with a focus closer to us here in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. Now, this series is brought to you by the Oregon Bee Atlas, a citizen science-based initiative to document the bee fauna of Oregon. The Bee Atlas is the biodiversity-focused arm of the Oregon Bee Project, which is a partnership between OSU Extension, the Oregon Department of Forestry, and Oregon Department of Agriculture, and it's dedicated to pollinator health in the state. The series is sponsored by Mount Pisgah Arboretum in Eugene, Oregon, a great place to observe flowering plants and the Arboretum's local bee fauna. And we're happy to have the Native Bee Society of British Columbia join us as a sponsor, and you can visit their beautiful website, bcnativebees.org, to learn more about their fauna, flora, and local initiatives. Also, I should note that there's a group in Washington State organizing to establish a bee society there. So if that interests you and you want to contribute, please get in touch. Now, in last month's episode, I had the pleasure of hosting one of my bee heroes, Olivia Messenger Carroll, the author of The Bees in Your Backyard. She introduced us to the bees in the US Southwest and showed us where bees keep their scissors and shopping bags. You can find her talk on our Oregon Bee Atlas YouTube channel, and please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Next month, we'll be hearing from Sarah Johnson, president of the Native Bee Society of British Columbia and PhD researcher at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. She'll be introducing us to North America's most diverse bumblebee fauna, and she'll entertain us with some tales from the field, I'm sure. Now, this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce colleagues from here at Oregon State University, Sandy DeBano and Scott Mitchell. Sandy is a professor in the College of Agricultural Sciences, the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. She's most often found in Northeast Oregon, where she works out of the Hermiston Agricultural Research and Extension Center. I'm a longtime fan of her work, which examines the community ecology of native bees in a landscape context with the goal of improving the management of these areas and their health. You can hear more from Sandy on episode 100 of the Pollination Podcast. Scott Mitchell is a PhD researcher here at OSU, working with Sandy out in Hermiston and Starkey Experimental Forest. He's been researching how grazing by cattle and native ungulates affects populations of flowering plants and their bee communities. If you're interested to hear more about this research, I encourage you to check out this video here, which is published on the OSU Extension Service YouTube channel. And there he describes his recent research and passion for lichen mustaches. Now, if you have any questions for our guests, and I hope you do, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll moderate them after the talk. Otherwise, please feel free to use the chat function, also located at the bottom, and I'm sure there'll be a few of us chatting in there during the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott and Sandy. It's all yours.
All right. I'll take over on screen share, and then Sandy will start our presentation. Just a moment.
Thank you, Link, for the introduction, and Anthony for inviting us to talk about our research here. Make sure we get the technology going. Okay, good to go, Scott?
Yeah, you should be good to go, and you should have control of the screen now, too.
All right, great, thank you. So first, I'd just like to acknowledge all our collaborators and support through the years, Mary Rowland and Mike Wisdom from the Forest Service, lots of our colleagues from Oregon State University, Skylar Burrows, a taxonomist we've been working with since 2014, and all the students that I'll talk about a little bit more in just a moment. We also want to acknowledge all our funding sources and all the different field and laboratory assistants we've had through the years. So I'd like to dedicate this presentation to our B team of students, starting with Chiho Komodo was the first student we had in our lab working with bees back in 2006. And as you can see there, she was quite the character and still is. And then after her initial getting us into that field, we had 3 undergraduates come work in the lab, and I'll be talking about some of their work today as well. Another undergrad, Samantha Roof, made a real contribution to the projects in our lab. And then Lauren Smith DiCarlo was a PhD student in the lab that finished up several years ago, and she continues to work on native bees, and we'll talk more about her research. And finally, most recently, 2 master students in our lab are Katie Arstingstall and Scott Mitchell, who you've already met, at least a younger version of Scott. And Scott finished up, both of them finished up in spring, and Scott has just started a PhD program this fall. And this is his first presentation with me, and so I've got to tell you right off the top that all the beautiful photos and the videos and the creative part of this presentation are really Scott's contribution rather than my own. So we're going to do kind of a tag team approach. I'll talk a while, then Scott, and we'll go back and forth. So as Link mentioned, we're actually stationed out in Eastern Oregon in Hermiston at the Hermiston Agricultural Research and Extension Center. And as Link also mentioned, we work on community ecology, and so that's just the study of the organization and function of interacting species in a particular space at a particular time. And our focus is really on beneficial invertebrates, and as Link mentioned, how they respond to management and disturbances. So when you mention Eastern Oregon, a lot of people just have maybe a blank mind to start out with. And then if they think about Oregon at all, they're usually thinking about Western Oregon. And so this is an interesting quote from a colleague that worked on bees on the west side of the state in a publication in 2010. And the statement says, the vast landscapes of ag production are interspersed with remnant vegetation as the state was dominated by forests until recently. And that got me thinking, well, what is the spread of forest in Oregon? Here's a map of it. And if you look west of the Cascades there, which you might see right here, indeed there is a lot of forest, but to the east of the Cascade, it's not dominated by forest really much at all. It's more grassland, shrub, steppe mixed with forest. And so the point is, we have rangelands in Eastern Oregon that include not only forested rangelands, but lots of shrub, steppe, and grassland as well. And it's a very diverse area. So if you think about bees of Eastern Oregon, when we started our work back in 2006, really it was kind of a black box. There was really a lack of systematic, detailed studies of bee communities in the eastern part of the state. And this has changed a lot, quite a bit, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years with projects like the Oregon Bee Atlas, and many agency scientists in the eastern part of the state are now doing a lot of bee studies, but it certainly wasn't the case so much about 15 years ago. So over that period of time, we have conducted multiple studies, primarily in the northeastern part of the state. All these little white circles are locations where we've done multi-year studies on bee communities in these areas. Today, Scott and I will be talking about 3 locations. The first one is the Nature Conservancy's Boardman Grassland Preserve. The second place we'll go is the Nature Conservancy's Zumwalt Prairie Preserve. And then we'll finally talk about the United States Forest Service Starkey Experimental Forest and Range. And now let's turn it over to Scott here.
Oh, oh, sorry, Sandy. Can you stop moving the mouse?
Okay.
Thanks. Perfect. All right. So in researching some of the bees at Eastern Oregon, our lab is focused on answering some pretty basic questions. So for example, some of the questions we ask are, how many species of bees are there in Eastern Oregon, and how common are those species? We're also interested in what kinds of species are present, and also, of course, what, where, and how questions. So specifically, what kind of life histories do these bees have? Where do they nest? How do they reproduce? And what do they eat? We're also interested in how bees vary across geographic space, and across time, both between seasons and within a single season. And we're also interested in how disturbance affects bee communities and interacts with the variations across time and space in those bee communities. Disturbance is, of course, a very general term, and this definition that you can see on the screen from White and Pickett does a pretty good job of describing what we mean by disturbance. And the specific kinds of disturbance events that can affect bees may include things like fires and storms, or climate change, or agriculture and livestock grazing, urbanization, invasive species, and of course pesticides. All these stressors can have pretty strong impacts on the native bees of Eastern Oregon. So you might be asking, well, how do the disturbances affect bees? Well, first, there's two main ways that we're interested in looking at how disturbance affects bees. So first, disturbance may affect bees directly, in other words, by killing bees, and that may be caused by an intense fire or something similar. But disturbance may also affect bees indirectly through habitat modifications, which could be as the result of something like livestock grazing, or cows eating all the flowers like the one is doing in this picture. Of course, even without stressors, a bee has needs. So the first thing that a bee needs, and this is probably something most of you know, is of course food, usually in the form of pollen and nectar. And as many of you probably already know, some bees, like this chimney bee, are relative specialists and only forage on a small group of plants. Other bees, like bumblebees, are broad generalists and will forage on a wider range of plants throughout the season. The second thing that all bees need is an area to nest in. And for most bees, this comes in the form of a hole in the ground. Other bees, however, will nest in wood or in twigs, and still other bees, like bumblebees, will nest in small cavities or in grass tussocks, like you can see on the left of the screen here. The last thing that all bees need is the ability to mate and reproduce. Of course, some bees will mate at the end of the summer, while other bees will mate in the spring. Males, of course, will find females in several different ways. So for some species, that means males will surveil nests and mate with emerging females. In other species, males will patrol areas and scent mark landmarks like trees, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And in still other species, like this goofy-looking male bumblebee, males may guard territories and mate with females in those territories. So how do we do our research? Well, the way that we approach our work is by conducting extensive field studies of bees and of the plants in those communities that Sandy was pointing out earlier on the map. And we use several methods to sample bee communities for our work. Our lab uses both passive methods like pan trapping and vane trapping, and more active methods like hand netting. And once we collect bees, we send all of our specimens to this guy, Skylar Burrows, who's a professional taxonomist that identifies all of our species for bees. And in all of our study systems, we've been studying bees and collecting bees and counting plants over the course of seasons and over the course of multiple years. We also sample vegetation and habitat characteristics using quite a few varieties of methods, including ground cover sampling, soil compaction sampling, canopy cover estimates, blooming plant transects, and plant richness surveys. So I'm going to move on to some parts of our talk today. So we're going to look at rangeland bee communities, shrubs in rangelands, disturbance on the range, and restoration. And I'll hand it back over to Sandy to start us off now.
All right. So we'll discuss the diversity in spatial and seasonal patterns first of these different rangeland bee communities. And I'm going to start at the Nature Conservancy's Boardman Grassland Preserve. This is a large preserve, 35 square miles. It's low elevation and it gets very little rainfall. Because it was, the history is it was actually a bombing range, a federal bombing range. And because of that, a lot of the area is fairly intact, but there was some grazing and some cultivation in the area. And because of these intact areas, it actually is one of the highest quality shrub, steppe, and arid grassland systems in the world. And that was one reason why the Nature Conservancy was interested in being involved in its management. It's dominated by blue bunch wheatgrass and other grasses, and the exotic species that are a big problem there are cheatgrass and medusa head. And so when you look at a picture of the Boardman Preserve, it's maybe not too awe-inspiring. It looks pretty hot, pretty dry, and I think it kind of belies the kind of diversity that actually occurs there. So it's kind of known, the highlights of it are for burrowing owls, long-billed curlews, antelope, and most importantly, the Washington ground squirrel, which was really the species that got the Nature Conservancy interested in the preserve in the first place. But we didn't know anything about the bees that occur there. And so this was a project that my PhD student, Lauren Smith DiCarlo, worked on. She did a 3-year study, and over that course of that time, found over 60 species of bees. And so this bee community was heavily dominated by sweat bees. And you see a picture of the agapostemon on the top left there, and other sweat bees. And it has very few species. I believe it's just 2 species of bumblebees. And this is Bombus gricicolis. And this is maybe not too surprising to most of you because it's a very, very warm system, maybe a system you don't expect to find very many bumblebees. I think it's still pretty surprising that we find so many species in what looks to be a pretty arid, desolate area. And because it's so warm, the bee species richness really peaks early in the season. So the phenology is pretty early phenology overall. And so now we're going to go a little more east in the state, and we're going to look at a different system, the Zumwalt Prairie. So this preserve is a bit larger than the Boardman Preserve, and it's got a much higher elevation and quite a bit more rainfall. And you can really see the difference just looking at the pictures. The grassland looks obviously a lot more lush, more forb diversity. The history is it had some cultivation and it has a long history of grazing, but it is one of the largest remnant intact pieces of Pacific Northwest bunchgrass prairie. So it's kind of like Palouse Prairie. And so it really is a very unique system. Lots of native bunch grasses that occur there. And until recently, didn't have real problems with annual grasses, but in the last 10 years or so, Vitinata dubia has invaded the system very badly, and Scott will talk a little bit more about that later. Some of its claims for fame are it's really diverse bird fauna, so lots of raptors, lots of grassland songbirds, building ground squirrels, wolves are back in the system, and it actually has the largest population of the threatened Spalding's catchfly in the world. And so it has lots of neat things to look at. The graduate student that worked on this project was Chiho Komoto, who I introduced to you before. She started working in the system in 2006. And over a 2-year study, we documented over 220 species of native bees. So a very diverse system. From small little bees like this fairy bee Perdita, very small, to our biggest bumblebees, Nevidensis here, and everything in between. And when we compare the diversity of bees that we find at the Zumwalt Prairie to other high diversity systems in the United States, like the Great Plains systems, we actually see that we're way up there in the number of species and morphospecies that we found. So I think The Zumwalt really is kind of this crown jewel of bee diversity that's very unique and well worth the visit. So what kind of bees do we find in that bee community? From Chiho's work, we find quite a few bumblebees, lots of sweat bees, similar to what we saw over at Boardman, and longhorn bees as well, but lots of different genera, so very diverse community. And it kind of differs from Boardman, and the species richness peaks a little bit later. Again, maybe not surprising given that it's a wetter, higher altitude system, but you really don't see the species richness peaking until June or July. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
So the next system that we'll talk about and visit a little bit is the United States Forest Service Starkey Experimental Forest and Range. And it's another system that we've studied the bee communities of pretty extensively. So Starkey is a little bit smaller than the Zumwalt, coming in at around 10,000 hectares. And it's pretty similar in elevation, around 1,100 feet to 1,100 meters to 1,500 meters in elevation. But it does get a little bit more rainfall. And because of that, there's a little bit more trees in the property. So the history of the U.S. Forest Service Starkey Experimental Forest is that of timber harvest and grazing. So historically, they used to graze in the forest quite a bit, and they used to actually commercially harvest timber here, including clear cuts. And it's currently an important site for studying the effects of ungulates, that is deer, elk, and cattle, on ecosystems and of course on bee communities. So Starkey was established as an experimental forest in 1940 that was meant to evaluate management effects on multiple resources. And what's really neat about Starkey is that the whole 10,000 hectares was enclosed with a game-proof fence in the mid-1980s to allow researchers to experimentally manipulate deer and elk densities within the forest. Now, most of Starkey is a pine and mixed coniferous forest with native bunch grasses interspersed. And while much of Starkey is a coniferous forest, where we've mostly worked has been in meadows and surrounding Meadow Creek, which is a riparian area that runs through the coniferous forests. These systems likely have a disproportionately high value compared to the surrounding landscape due to really high biodiversity and unique species assemblages that occur within the riparian area. They also have a really long history of disturbance and restoration, which allows us to understand how restoration affects bees. And finally, riparian systems are key grazing resources in rangelands, so it's pretty important to understand how disturbances, such as grazing, can affect local animal populations and, of course, local bee populations. Another reason Meadow Creek is pretty interesting is Meadow Creek was recently restored in a really large-scale restoration project, which included planting over 40,000 native trees and shrubs within the riparian area. During the restoration, a large system of exclosures was built for an experimental ungulate grazing project. Our overall goals are to collaborate with the Forest Service, and specifically we collaborate quite a bit with the Forest Service wildlife biologist Mary Rowland on, thought I fixed that earlier. So I'm Mary Rowland on increasing our understanding of riparian bee communities and examining how native ungulates and cattle affect bees, while also monitoring the bee community responses to riparian restoration. One thing that's been pretty clear to us is that riparian areas are extremely diverse. In just over 3 years of study, we've already found over 240 species of bees in the Meadow Creek area. And down on the bottom of the slide, you can see just a sampling of the bees, mostly larger ones that we've seen in the area, but we've seen a whole bunch of small bees, big bees, little bees, everything in between. So along this creek, species richness, it's maybe not surprising, peaks a little bit later than the other systems and peaks in July, with upwards of around 80 species that are active and flying during this month. So we're going to talk for just a second about bee and plant species of special interest, both in Starkey and in the Zumwalt. So a question you might be asking is, do rangelands support sensitive bee species? We've already showed you that there's pretty diverse bee communities in these systems, but are any of these bees sensitive or vulnerable species? So an interesting find at both Starkey and the Zumwalt is the western bumblebee, or Bombus occidentalis. This bee was once abundant across all the Pacific Northwest, but largely disappeared from at least the western half of the states in the 1990s, which is probably because of pathogens from commercial rearing. And at the Zumwalt, we actually have the highest number of recorded Bombus occidentalis bees in a single location since the 1990s. And at Starkey, we've recently collected a few individuals and actually seen a few ones, like this individual seen in this video. We actually saw this bee just a few months ago this summer, foraging on lupin in some upland forests at Starkey. And you can see she's actually a pretty big bee and has pretty big pollen loads and looks, I mean, at least like she's flying pretty healthy. So now we know that they support sensitive native bees, but what about sensitive rangeland plant species? Well, we already mentioned this plant that you can see in this image. And this is a perennial wildflower, the Spalding's catchfly. This plant was listed as threatened in 2001, but it's relatively common in the Zumwalt, and as Sandy mentioned, is actually this is the location where it is the most abundant in all of the world. It blooms in late July and early August, and because that's pretty late in the season for the Zumwalt, Sandy and some of her collaborators were interested in what pollinates it. So this was before I joined the lab, but Sandy and several other folks, including Carmen, Chris, Natalie, Chiho, and Rob, who are listed here, set out to see what was visiting the plant. And interestingly, they found that only 2 species of bees visited the catchfly. Most of the visits were from the yellow bumblebee, or Bombus fervidus, but around 10% of the visits were from the white-shouldered bumblebee, or Bombus appositus. Interestingly, both of these bees are long-tongued species, and also what's really interesting is around half of the specimens that were caught and detected visiting this flower were males. So here you can see a bumblebee visiting the Spalding's catchfly, and that flower morphology might suggest why only long-tongued bees are visiting this flower. So we're going to switch gears now and talk about the role of shrubs in rangelands. And we'll examine a few case studies, one from aspen stands at the Zumwalt and one from riparian areas in Starkey, and a few case studies that are kind of mixed between those areas. So while people often think of the range as purely grasslands, rangelands are not necessarily just endless seas of grass, even though it looks that way in a photo, and it looks that way even if you're there in person on the grassland. But in fact, spatial variability likely plays a pretty important role in shaping and supporting rangeland bee communities. So one such rare habitat, or one such variability to the habitat on the range, is aspen stands. And the Zumwalt has quite a few smaller aspen stands distributed throughout the property. And Sandy and some of her collaborators, again, this was before I joined the lab, have investigated the bees of these stands. So we were speaking about rare and threatened bees and plants before, and aspen stands are actually becoming a rare or threatened habitat. In fact, across the United States, in the western half of the US, there's been a loss of 60 to 90% of aspens from most areas, or many areas. And it's likely that they're threatened by herbivory, urbanization, agriculture, and disease. And you can kind of see the trees in this picture don't necessarily look like the healthiest trees. And again, as I mentioned before, this work was conducted by some other folks in the lab. They're the same folks that did the catchfly work, and their names are listed here. So this work involved sampling bees and flowers in the aspen stands and in adjacent grasslands throughout the summer. And the results of this research really showed that aspen stands have more flowers later in the summer than adjacent grasslands, and more different flower types than the grasslands nearby. Additionally, there were more bumblebees and more male bumblebees in aspen stands than in adjacent grasslands. But while there were more bumblebees, there were fewer sweat bees in the aspen stands. It's also an interesting note that there are quite a few patrolling scent marking bumblebee species that were strongly associated with aspen stands, which might be because the trees are a landmark like we mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about shrubs in riparian areas. So this is my work and I can talk to it a little bit more thoroughly. But in investigating the role of shrubs in riparian areas, we're really interested in answering a couple questions. So first, how do bees, shrubs, and forbs interact in the early season, which in the case of Starkey is April? And second, how are bees interacting with shrubs in riparian restoration areas? So to answer our questions, we used a method that most of you are probably very familiar with. We did a whole lot of hand knitting. So we conducted these surveys along an 11-kilometer section of Meadow Creek in Starkey. And this section was a restored portion of riparian area, where, as we mentioned, in 2012 and 2013, over 50,000 shrubs and native trees were planted in the area. And many of these shrubs that were planted included flowering shrubs. So some of the shrubs in the riparian area that we are interested in examining in Starkey were willow, waxcurrant, hawthorn, and dogwood. These shrubs often have abundant pollen and nectar that's available for bees to forage on. As you can see in this video that's playing in the background of this slide, this bee has a pretty full pollen loads on her legs, and she's foraging on a pretty common willow species in eastern Oregon called coyote willow. So our first question in April 2018 is when we answered this question, which was how do bees, shrubs, and forbs interact early in the season? So in April of 2018, which is right after snowmelt in this area, we counted over 22,000 blooms on 25 different forb species and on 2 shrub species. And you can see the 2 shrub species pictured below. I should note this is a picture of coyote willow. The willows that we counted this year were largely not coyote willow. Coyote willow generally blooms a little later in the year, but there were a few other willows like monocolor willow and a few others. And what's interesting here is that while we were doing exhaustive searches of the area, we counted or observed 37 bees foraging on plants of various types. But what's really interesting is that 57% of the bees that we observed were foraging on willow, and the rest were foraging on a smattering of other plants. And this is in spite of willow making up less than 10% of the total number of the blooms we observed. So that second question, how are bees interacting with shrubs in riparian restoration areas? So with this question, we did a whole bunch of hand knitting, and we took all the bees that we collected from all the plants they were collected on and created some plant pollinator networks. And before I get into the networks, I just wanted to tell you some basic numbers about the bees that we collected. So we collected 1,886 bees from 150 different species over the course of these 2 years. Of these, 641 individuals were foraging on one of 16 different shrub species when they were caught. The remaining 1,245 bees were foraging on one of 76 different forb species that were growing in the area. And it's important to note here that 30 species were observed only on shrubs, 70 were observed only on forbs, and 50 of those species were observed on both forbs and shrubs throughout the 2 years. And of course, lots of bees that we observed were pretty rare, so around 20% of the bee species that we observed are represented by a single specimen or a single observation throughout the course of the 2 years of our study. So before I get into the real plant pollinator networks, because 1,800 is a lot of bees and a lot of interactions, I'm going to explain a little bit what we're looking at with a cartoon network. So on one side of the network, we have bee species, and on the other side of the network, we'll have plant species. Each box here represents a species, and the size of the box corresponds to the number of specimens that we collected from a certain bee species or off of a certain plant species. Lines are then drawn between the bees and the plants, and the width of the lines corresponds to the number of interactions between a particular shrub and bee, or plant and bee. As you can see from this network, some bees, like this one, appear to be pretty specialized on one or a few plant species, while other bees, like this one, appear to be pretty generalist in their interactions and forage on a lot of different plant species. So in the networks that I'm going to show you, I've also organized and colored bees according to the proportion of specimens that were observed on forbs or on shrubs. So the bees that are red in the next networks are going to be those bees that observed mostly or exclusively on shrubs, while those that are pink were bees that were found foraging on both shrubs and forbs. And those that are white were ones that were found foraging only on forbs. Of course, with the plants, I also colored them so that you can tell which plants are shrubs and which are forbs. So plants that are colored blue are going to be those that are shrubs, and plants that are green are those that are forbs. Now here's the full network. And obviously it's a lot more complicated than the diagram I was just showing you. But what I'm really just trying to show you here is there's a lot of interactions that are going on between flowering plants and forbs throughout the season. And I'm going to take this network and break it out into months. So you'll see a different network on the next slide for each month that we sampled. This helps us see a little bit of what's happening throughout the season. So in this network, you can see that in April and May, more bees were captured on shrubs than on forbs. And this changes throughout the season so that in June and July, fewer and fewer bees were captured on shrubs than on forbs. And by August and September, we weren't catching any bees on any shrubs. And that's likely because there were very few, if any, shrubs blooming. So of course the bees were not foraging on those shrubs. Now I'm going to dive into one interaction that's my personal favorite interesting interaction that we found in these networks. And that's the interaction between the Pacific digger bee and wax currant. So while this bee has been documented to be foraging on many different plant species, we caught over 100 individuals of this bee throughout our 2 seasons. And 98% of those individuals were caught foraging on wax currant. And just anecdotally, most of the time when I'm out in Eastern Oregon, if I find a wax currant, I almost definitely find a Pacific digger bee. So that maybe indicates to us that the wax currant is possibly an important resource for this bee. To wrap up this section, I thought I'd just mention some of the major takeaways from this research. So first, our networks and early season searches, we believe that shrubs are a pretty important early season resource for bees. And particularly, they are a pretty dense resource when there's not too many other blooms out there. Shrubs can also support a very diverse group of pollinators. And wax currant and hawthorn are resistant to herbivory from deer and elk, which may make them appealing plants to plant in riparian areas that have high levels of ungulate herbivory. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sandy to talk a little bit about disturbance on the range.
Great, thanks, Scott. Love those photos. All right, so we're going to talk about 3 different types of disturbance today: herbivory, fire, and invasive annual grasses, and how those affect bee communities. So herbivory will focus first on livestock grazing, and as you're all aware, it's a widespread land use in the western U.S. It's an important economic driver of rural communities, and a lot of nonprofits, including the Nature Conservancy, are really interested in developing sustainable livestock practices. And so it's really an important type of research to do to inform people's management. So our question was, what's the effect of livestock grazing on bees? Is it likely it's going to be through direct mortality? No, not really, unless a bee gets stepped on. But more likely, it's through habitat modification, so things that affect food and nesting. And so Again, this is Chiho Komoto's master's project, and she was very interested in looking at how grazing intensity affects bees. And so we hypothesized that one way that grazing could impact bees is through eating plants, including flowers and grass, so food and nesting material, and also through impacts on soil, whether it's trampling or other types of effects. So it just so happened that we had a very large-scale manipulative study going on that year in the Zumwalt Prairie in 2006 and 7, where we had 1640 hectare pastures that were being exposed to high, moderate, low, and no grazing. And this was an early summer grazing schedule, so all these cattle were mostly out in June. And then there's an aerial picture of the sites to the right. And so we measured a variety of variables, including utilization, and we used that really to quantify the amount of livestock use. And that's just basically a measure of how much biomass we think that the livestock actually removed. We also obviously counted blooming stems. We measured vegetation structure. And then working with Heidi Schmaltz here, who was also doing a master's project looking at soils, we analyzed compaction and stability and soil surface cover. And of course, we measured bee abundance, richness, diversity, and community composition, which again is just the types of species and the relative abundance in the larger bee community. And so what did we find? Well, first let's look at blooming plants. What did we see for patterns? On these graphs that I'll show you here, utilization's on the x-axis. So that's your measure of grazing intensity, and then the response variables on the y-axis. And what you see here is that we have two species of flowers that seem to be fairly sensitive to grazing. Hoary balsam root and twin arnica both decreased quite substantially with increased grazing pressure. We also saw some effects on soils. We saw increased soil compaction and the amount of bare ground with increased grazing, and decreased soil stability and herbaceous litter with increased grazing. So this just indicates that we have things changing in both the plants and the soil, which could potentially affect bees. So the question, did it affect bees? And the answer is always complicated, but it did affect some bees. And so bumblebees, particularly early in the season. So this is a graph of data for Bombus californicus in June. And again, you see utilization on the x-axis. As you have more grazing occurring, your numbers of Bombus californicus decrease. And so this would suggest that this species might be sensitive to livestock grazing. In contrast, we had a sweat bee, unnamed morpho species, that actually tended to increase with increased grazing. So potentially they're reacting things like to more bare ground or other factors. So our conclusions based on this study and some additional work that we've done since then is that livestock grazing certainly can influence habitat variables related to both food and nesting. It can negatively influence some species of bees, but potentially positively influence others. And that considering dietary overlap is really important. So we need to think about which plant species, particular bee species, prefer to feed on and how that relates to the ones that cattle prefer to feed on. If they both prefer the same species, you have a high degree of overlap and potentially you'll have more problems in those situations. And of course, the temporal component is really important here. So we observe these negative effects early in the season. This guy is thinking about, well, could we use this knowledge to maybe minimize the risk to bees by changing grazing regimes just a bit? And so this is kind of what Scott focused on as part of his master's degree, looking at whether you can delay the turnout time for cattle by just a week or two and potentially minimize some of these negative effects on bumblebees, for example. And so he did a study looking at both Starkey and the Zumwalt, and the cattle were turned out after the peaks in blooming, flowering, and bee diversity. And what he found was that he wasn't able to detect any significant effects of the cattle on bees in that situation. Although at Starkey, he did find a negative effect on plants, both in the number of blooms and the number of species blooming. And so that sort of suggests that the riparian areas might be a little bit more vulnerable to grazing than grasslands. And as I recall, Scott, these utilization rates were fairly similar. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's not all about livestock all the time. So a thing that we need to consider too is native ungulate grazing. And so as Scott mentioned, we work with Mary Rowland, a wildlife biologist, and she has to work on issues that wildlife managers care about, and native ungulates is one of those issues. There's a lot of uncertainty in the public about what effects are due to livestock and what may be due to native ungulates, especially since we have this kind of historical removal of top predators. It has this cascading effect of increasing herbivores like deer and elk, and that may negatively impact plant communities and things that the animals that depend on those plants, like bees. So that was our question, was what effect does native ungulate grazing have on bees? And just like with livestock, we expect those effects to be modified through habitat. So we were interested in how native ungulates influence native bees at Meadow Creek is where we did the experiment. We had 12 sites there. We manipulated ungulate grazing by excluding deer and elk from half of those sites and then allowing them access to the other half. And this was a 3-year study. And the big native ungulate, the most abundant native ungulate in the Meadow Creek system is elk. And so, which is interesting because their diets are typically include more forbs than mule deer. So we expect them to have a higher dietary overlap with bees compared to deer. And that's kind of what a literature review we did suggests that in fact is true. Some work by Josh Everett, Mary Rowland, and others found evidence that elk are really structuring plant communities here, particularly shrubs. And so this is a graph showing 4 species of shrubs in Meadow Creek. The orange bars are protected, the blue are unprotected from elk. And you can see growth is really decreased when elk and deer have access to them. So our expectations for this experiment were that the flowering stems of species that were preferred by elk would become relatively more abundant in areas that had been protected from deer and elk compared to ones that are exposed. And in contrast, for species that elk either avoid or they're kind of neutral towards, we expected that they would remain equally abundant in the grazed versus the ungrazed sites. And so I'm just going to show you 2 examples. Slender Cinquefoil, or Potentilla gracilis, is a preferred elk species and one that bees frequently forage on. And it's also the most abundant flowering plant that occurs at Meadow Creek. And what you see in this graph is that when the experiment started in 2014, there wasn't any differences in the number of blooming stems of Potentilla gracilis in grazed and ungrazed sites. But as time goes by, and elk are allowed access to those grazed areas, you see that they decrease in the number of stems of Potentilla. So it's what we expected we would see with a preferred elk plant. Common yarrow, in contrast, Achillea mellifolium, is a neutral species for elk, but bees do visit it. It's very common, but we didn't expect to see it changing through time, and in fact, we didn't see significant differences. They remained relatively abundant in both the grazed and ungrazed sites. So do we see any effects of these changes in plant community on bee species? We did, in fact, see a decrease in bee species richness in May and July of the last year of the study in the grazed areas, so the areas that were exposed to native ungulate grazing. So the conclusions that we have so far about ungulate grazing in bees are that large mammal herbivory can have an effect on bee communities, and that really depends on the location and the timing of the herbivory. the animal's dietary preferences and the relative abundance of other flowers and forage at that time. And the native ungulates graze on a lot of different species that are commonly visited by bees. And so you do have to consider this aspect of dietary overlap when you're trying to understand what kind of issues you might have. And we found in this system that native ungulate herbivory can decrease native bee species richness. And so a project that we're just finishing up now is actually looking at the effect of native ungulates and livestock at the same time. And so given our experimental design, we'll be able to partition out the effects of each. And so we're looking forward to seeing what the data show us on that. And then now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work we've done with fire in these rangelands. As you're all aware, fire can be used as a management tool to recreate historical disturbances, reduce fuel loads, and deal with new problems like invasive species. It can also be a catastrophic disturbance, and that can be exacerbated by climate change. So it's really important to understand how fire affects bees, and it in fact can affect them through direct mortality if you have very intense fires and shallow nesting bees, for example. And it definitely can affect habitat, although how really depends a lot on the system, the duration of the fire, its severity, and how long it's been since the burn occurred. So there's lots of variables to look at. I'm going to tell you a little story about a fire on the Boardman Preserve that happened in June 2015. This is a picture I took. You can tell because it's blurry. It's not one of Scott's. But we were out working with Lauren. This was the second year of her 3-year research project. And she had 18 plots out there. And we noticed the smoke. And sure enough, that fire ended up burning through half of her sites, about half, which at the time seemed like a really bad thing. But we realized it was an opportunity to investigate the effects of fire on bee communities in this arid grassland. So because it hit kind of mid-study, we were able to have the kind of data before the fire and after the fire, which turned out really nice. You can see some pictures here of 1 year before, right after the fire, and 1 year later. So what happened to the habitat after the fire a year later? There was some good news. There was reduced invasive annual grasses, and that was cheatgrass and medusa head. But there was some bad news, and that was there was reduced cover of these biological soil crusts. They're really important in these systems. What about the plants? Well, there was actually a flush of certain forbs a year after the fire, like tall willow herb and hoary tansy aster and Russian thistle. And did we see a response in bees to these changes? And in fact, bee species richness and diversity did increase in burned areas the year after the fire. And fire changed the bee community. In other words, the species and the relative proportion changed. So some bee species increased in abundance in burned areas. 2 examples are Halictus tripartitus and this megachilid. We had more agapostamine and more of their cuckoo bees, the sphesodes, in the burned areas. And we wonder, well, why? Why did we see this particular response to fire? And some of the variables we measured lead us to believe that it potentially has something to do with increased forb abundance and also the change in the particular forb community. Also, it could be related to nesting conditions, so more bare ground and potentially more nesting resources for bees that, for example, use charred wood. So kind of our conclusions about fire and bees at this point are its interaction with other disturbances is really important. So this interaction with invasive weeds, livestock grazing, climate change, that needs a lot of research. The very short-term effects of fire can differ from what we found a year later. Love and Kane, for example, found fewer active species 2 to 3 weeks after fire. And likewise, long-term effects can be very different and difficult to predict, so really dependent on the system. I worry about Boardman, particularly because of that destruction of that biological soil crust may make it more likely to be invaded by cheatgrass and medusa head. And we haven't had the opportunity to go back there and see what happens since 2016. That would be a very interesting project. But we are doing some continued research on fire at the Zumwalt, looking at long-term effects of controlled burns there. And then now I'm going to switch off to Scott.
I'm going to talk briefly about non-native species and invasive species as a disturbance on the range, and then I'll just take us out for the rest of the presentation. So one final thought regarding the disturbance on range is the invasive of non-native plant species. So in particular, recent invasions of annual grasses like Bentonata dubia, which we mentioned earlier, has spread widely throughout the prairie and through even forested areas like Starkey. And we're currently studying how this is affecting floral resources in bee communities, but this is definitely something we're still working on. And finally, we're interested in examining the effects of livestock, or the interacting effects of livestock disturbance and invasive annual grasses. As you can see from the top photo on the right there, that cattle trail is pretty well inhabited by Bentonata, that lighter colored grass. So we're interested in looking at the interactions between those two disturbances. But again, that's something we're still investigating. So we'll conclude this talk just with some potentially hopeful opportunities for restoration that benefits pollinator communities. So the first thing to know about restoration is that it's already happening across broad swaths of land in the United States and abroad. There are, of course, many square miles of habitat that are degraded from a multitude of human disturbances, and there is a public and scientific interest in improving habitat quality, of course, for bees and for other animals. But, of course, most of the time, the primary goals of restoration projects are not concerned or even focused on bees, or even around other invertebrates. And this has led our lab to ask the question, how do these restoration projects, those that aren't focused on invertebrates or focused on bees, affect bees? And I'll briefly present a few case studies that our labs investigated with this question in mind. So the first case study comes from the TNC Boardman Preserve, and this was conducted by Lauren as part of her dissertation. So this study was conducted again on the Boardman Preserve, and as part of a large restoration effort conducted between 2006 and 2012, the Nature Conservancy treated large parts of the reserve with glyphosate, which is an herbicide, and seeded the land with native bunch grasses and a few forbs, but mostly bunch grasses, which look like this. While this may seem surprising that there's no effect of restoration on bees, Lauren did find that bee species in native prairies or native grasslands that were undegraded habitats were pretty different from those of either passively restored or actively restored sites. And while this seems surprising, it's maybe not too surprising given that restored sites often had fewer flowers and different types of flowers than native prairie sites or native grassland sites. So while it's pretty clear that restoration did not improve habitat for pollinators in that first case study in Boardman, we still think that there's a way to make restoration more successful, even in cases where bees are not the focus of restoration. So in many cases, we do not know enough about the bees or plant communities in an area to know what is best for the bees, and getting more basic knowledge about the bees and plant communities is the first step to improving habitat restoration outcomes for bees. And second, understanding how disturbances affect bees is important. After all, we saw earlier in this talk that some disturbances, like fire, may actually benefit certain groups of bees. And third, specifically focusing on the habitat characteristics that are good for bees and knowing which plants bees like, and providing more food and nesting resources for bees is needed. And finally, protecting resources that already exist in an area may be an important step to maintaining habitat quality during restorations. So as I mentioned earlier, our lab is interested in improving restoration efforts in Eastern Oregon. One of the ways that we've done that is in research conducted by Samantha Roof, Sandy, and others. And Samantha was a former undergraduate researcher in the lab. And her work focused on looking at bee plant and associations. And she made hundreds of associations between bees and hundreds of species of plants using extensive handnet data from Starkey. And this work can help to improve our knowledge of floral resources that different bee species require, and thus can help inform future restoration plannings that may be directed at bees. My work, which I talked about a little bit earlier, also contributes to our ability to fine-tune restoration projects to help bees. So as we mentioned earlier, riparian restoration aimed at improving salmon habitat often involves planting shrubs, and choosing shrubs that bees like to visit can help improve resource availability for bees in riparian areas while accomplishing salmon restoration goals. And secondly, using shrubs that are resistant to deer and elk herbivory, like waxcurrant or hawthorn, are good ways to help ensure both the success of pollinator and stream restoration goals. So finally, some of the more recent work done in our lab by Katie Arstingstall, who just finished her master's degree, has explored high-tech ways of determining which flowers bees are collecting pollen on. So Katie's used hand knitting, where she puts bees in vials and collects them, like many of you have probably done, combined with DNA metabarcoding to determine which plants bees are actually using. And this allows us to go beyond behavioral observations and potentially better fine-tune plants for restoration plantings by understanding not just what the bee was on when we caught it, but by understanding what the bee was carrying in terms of the pollen it had on its body. So we just wanted to conclude with some hope for the future. So overall, our research has led us to be hopeful about the status of pollinator communities in Eastern Oregon rangelands. Our knowledge about disturbance can help inform future actions, and we know now more than we have perhaps ever known about the Eastern Oregon bee fauna. And at least in certain cases, habitat restoration can be successful. And finally, the research in our lab has given us hope that fine-tuning restorations will be able to help improve overall outcomes for pollinators in the future. And that's all we've got for you guys tonight. So I think we'll hand it back over to Link for questions. Is that how we're doing this? Or?
Absolutely. That was fantastic. Thanks, folks. So we are running a bit long and we don't want to keep people all evening. So I will go into a few questions. Let's see. With respect to counting 22,000 blooms, how do you do that? Do you take a smaller area, then estimate that for the entire range?
No, that's actually a literal count. We had 11 pastures that we searched exhaustively. The pastures were all around 1 to 2 hectares in size. And we searched all of them and counted every single bloom we could find.
You use a clicker, I imagine.
We use a notepad.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right.
Because we're counting them by species, not just number.
I like Carol's question, which is, what was the most popular shrub and forb for bees? And I'll expand that to say which species hosted the highest species richness, which plant?
Oh, maybe Sandy knows overall highest species richness. I think with shrubs, oh man, I think it was waxcurrant was the highest overall species richness.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I don't know about for forbs though, off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'll have to look at the data to see. Yeah, we have, that's a very good question. But Samantha Roof's paper though, if anyone really wants to look at the particular forbs that occur in Starkey, she has a preference index for each one calculated. So, and we actually have a little handout too that I could send anyone who would want a list of kind of the top forbs in Eastern Oregon based on our data.
Okay. So we have a question from one of our Oregon Bee Atlas participants here, and they're wondering, given that we're in the end of summer times, where in Eastern Oregon might be good places to collect a diversity of bees outside of your sampling area? and given that they've been to the Steens and Strawberry Mountains midsummer.
This late, wow, I don't know. Yeah.
Alpine areas, maybe?
Alpine, yeah, late. Try and capture some late alpine, or maybe late season asters in the desert, rabbit brush.
Yeah,
and those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Yeah, that's one issue at Boardman. We'd always miss that, the bloom there, because it'd be so late in fall and people go back to school. So.
Let's see here.
I did see the question from Ray about whether it was rotational versus season-long grazing. It is rotational, Ray, in all the study sites.
So we'll do one more question. Let's see. I like this one. Following disturbance, did you notice if any of the bee families or genera were more prevalent?
Well, we know Agapostemon, for example, increased after the burning at Boardman, and then Bombus tended to decrease, especially in species richness, at the Zumwalt after early season grazing. So yeah, it definitely seems like there are some genus level responses, but it can vary within a genus too. So
certainly, depending on their life history traits.
Yeah,
I would imagine. Well, folks, that's it from Sandy and Scott. I have a couple slides as the outro, so we'll do that. And thanks for your great presentation. It was an incredible review of all of the research going on out there. Very encouraging.
Yeah, thanks for hosting, Link and Anthony.
My pleasure. So folks, if you're interested in learning more about native bees, consider joining the Master Melittologist program. The Master Melittologist program is a Master Gardener type program where you'll learn how to contribute to the Oregon Bee Atlas. The program provides extensive learning opportunities about native bees. You'll have the opportunity to go on bee research adventures, contribute towards bee conservation, and make amazing discoveries with the Oregon Bee Atlas. Projects like the Atlas are supported by grants and especially by donations. Please consider giving a gift to the Oregon Bee Atlas of any size by visiting our website or contact us to discuss endowments. Now, when you leave, you'll be prompted to complete a short survey asking you about topics you'd like to hear about in the future. So just take 1 minute and let us know what you'd like to hear about on the wild world of bees. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in September. Good night.